Welcome, welcome. We're just waiting for a few more people to shuffle their way in, and then we'll get started.
Start in 1 minute. I'll time it for everybody.
Okay. Give us the 3, 2, 1, go.
Hope everyone's gearing up for the holidays. Can't say I'm not looking forward to it myself.
Did you get all your presents wrapped, Bob?
Did I get all my presents? That's the question. Fortunately, I only have one person on my Secret Santa list.
It's 1L, isn't it?
Yes. Well, not really. But all of you, I have a post-Christmas present for everybody. We'll be actually sharing some research we've done on what emerging programs are out there. These are things that don't fit in any of the traditional data sets. You're not going to find them in iPads. You won't find them in occupations and so forth because they're just too new to be in those data sets. So I'll share with you when that webinar is coming up so you can get the year started with some fresh thinking. Let's go ahead and get started today. If you'd like to do introductions, Marianne.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you all for joining us, and we're discussing academic program evaluation for higher education. And each month we do share the latest trends and insights for academic program planning. We are pleased to have with us Bob Atkins, Gray's CEO, founder, and best-selling author. Allow me to just share a few housekeeping items if you don't mind. If you have any questions, please place them in the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen. We'll try to get to as many of them as possible, and we can follow up with you offline if we do run out of time. You can also use the chat area for comments and discussion. After the webinar, we will be sending you a link to the slides in the video recording. And finally, we will launch a poll. We'd love to hear your feedback on how we did and how the content did for you. So if you don't mind filling that out. And without further ado, I will hand things off to Bob to get us started.
Thank you very much, Marianne. And today I'll be sharing results through November 2022. And for those of you who don't already know me, I am Bob Atkins. I'm the founder here at Gray Associates, and delighted to be with you today on our last webinar of 2022. A little bit of a reminder who Gray is. We're the creators of the first, I believe, complete program evaluation system, which includes data on markets, that's things like student demand and employment that we'll share today. Margins, that is what are the economics of academic programs. Academic standards, are you passing your students? What kind of DFW rates do you have? Who's graduating? And finally, mission. And we believe those are the 4 critical ingredients in terms of the data required to evaluate an academic program. But they would be incomplete without the surrounding people and process. So we've designed an interactive process where the folks can look at this information, both your academic and your administrative leaders, and make sound decisions that incorporate their judgment. And our belief is without the right involvement, without the right process, program decisions just aren't effective. They don't get done. They take a long time, and the programs that are selected often don't get implemented. So the people and process are really a critical part of this, but a data-informed process is also important. So it's sort of the foundation, if you will, for the people and process part. In addition to that, we do a few other things. We do work on pricing to optimize pricing using competitive research, discrete choice surveys, and actually providing our clients with pricing simulators so they can see what will happen to an enrollment and margins if they change their prices. We also do location analysis, whether that's to help you understand where to add a campus or where you should market your program and get above average returns on your marketing investment. And financial planning models that now simulate events, decisions, and whole strategies and provide pro forma results over a 10-year period. And that can model everything from the impact of a change in the return on your investment portfolio or your endowment draw rate down to how many students you want to have to set as the minimum class size on your campus. As I mentioned, one of our favorite things every year, we do piece of research on 5 emerging programs, and we'll have that on Thursday, January 12th at 2:00 Eastern Standard Time. And you can find it on our website under 5 emerging programs to watch webinar. So at the end of this presentation, we'll fire up Pez and take your requests for programs. If you have a program in mind, please let us know in the chat and we'll get that ready for you. However, it's possible we won't get to everything in this meeting. If not, we'd be glad to send you a scorecard later this week, or given what week it is, perhaps the week after this. Now, on to what we're the meat of this. The first part of what we'll talk about is student demand. And we have leading indicators, lagging indicators, and current indicators for student demand that we'll share with you. Unemployment, pretty much we're looking at current data, and then we'll share non-degree courses. Many of you are looking at things that are less than a degree, a certificate, adult education kinds of courses. Share some data on those. We have new information on college athletics, in particular cost benchmarking for college athletics we'll share. And then we'll wrap up the presentation part of this with program of the month and provide you a summary, and then we'll turn it over to Anel, who will answer your questions and actually look at specific programs you may be interested in. Now, when you think about student demand, given the season, it's kind of like Dickens' Christmas Carol. We can think of it as the demand of Christmas past, enrollment, Christmas present, and Google searches, if you will, the ghost of Christmas future. So think of it along that spectrum. When we think about the past, it's really completions that we look at. That gives us great data on long-term trends running back 10, 20 years, even more. It's a consistent taxonomy by and large, and it encompasses everybody who's a non-for-profit, anyone who takes Title IV aid. So again, very complete. But it's backwards looking. The most current data from iPads is 2020, the academic year 2020, 2021. But people chose their major 2 or 3 years before that if they're getting an associate's degree or a certificate, 3 to 5 years before that if they're getting a bachelor's degree, and God knows how many years before that if they're getting a doctorate. So I think of that data set right now, if you had 2021 data, you'd be looking at what students wanted at the associate's level in about 2019, at the bachelor's level, and oh gosh, it could be 2016 and before. So it's quite dated in terms of what students want now. The other thing you have to remember about iPads is it's not really, our data is cleaned up and the taxonomy at iPads is reasonably current right now, but it is a problem from time to time. A new and emerging program simply won't show up on iPads till 5 or 10 years after it's been established because they don't update the taxonomy very frequently. Enrollment is quite different. It's really picking up on what's happening almost this moment in terms of what people want. It's actually updated 3 times a year, comes to the National Student Clearinghouse, also very comprehensive. Still a bit of a prisoner of the SIP taxonomy. So the SIP codes, if there's no SIP code, for example, for data science, as it was true for a number of years, it still won't show up there. But it's very current data and it's reasonably comprehensive, and there's a good time series. Google search is a bit different. That's actually telling us what students are searching for right now, but that's going to be the future demand in terms of enrollment. So in Google, we can see what people are going to enroll in, not this minute, but over the next 3, 6, 9, 12 months. So as we go through this data, keep that in mind. Google search is giving you a lens in the future, enrollment, current trends, and iPads is the past. Now, when we think about demand, we portray it in a time series where last year, that's 2020, is in the dark blue, and this year, 2022, is in the light blue. And Google search volume is a happy story, up 9%. It's actually been up for the last 5 months, actually longer than that. It's been up all this year, I should say. And so it's an optimistic story that demand for higher ed should be increasing as we look forward. What had the greatest interest? Well, registered nursing, and not surprising, often the case here. Business came in second, accounting third, computer science, and watch this pair of 3 things as we go through the data: computer science, data analytics, and cybersecurity. You can see them there in positions 4, 5, and 6, if you will. Very related courses, similar skills that need to be taught, although after that sort of introductory period, they branch out into their own distinct areas. Then we have law, psychology, criminal justice, and human resources management. In November, cybersecurity won the cause here and got the highest number of the fastest growth in search volumes, followed closely by data analytics. Remember that triumvirate there of cyber, data analytics, and computer science. 2 out of the 3 show up here as well. And we have another data science related program down there in business analytics in the red. So again, these are now substantial programs, but they're also growing very quickly. Then we have more general programs, organizational leadership, dentistry, fine studio arts, actually 3 arts programs here: fine studio arts, cinematography, and acting. We have theology making the list again. And this is a pretty persistent trend in terms of a growing program. I've been watching it for the last 2 or 3 years. This month, it's up 66% year over year. Then we have growth in registered nursing. Now you can see this is lagging behind the others on a percentage basis, but remember how large this program is and how much interest there is. 60% growth in one of the top 2 programs in the United States is very, very substantial. And the oddball here to me is, and again, been cropping up for a few months now, cinematography. I went back, I checked the individual keywords we pulled. They all make sense. I don't know quite what's driving that, but I find it very interesting, paired up there with acting in this case, though. Acting is new to the list, and cinematography has been cropping up for the last several months. So something's going on there in terms of student interest. Perhaps it's interest in self-production of blogs and vlogs and so forth, or a broader interest in more traditional media. In November, the cost of Google clicks was highest for the following programs. Number 1, accounting and finance at $53. Now, remember, that's one of the biggest programs, and people are competing hard to get those students. So they're paying $53.49 per click. Now let's think about that for a minute. If you're very fortunate, 1 in 100 clicks is going to convert to an actual student. So that $53 means that somebody's willing to spend $5,300 per student for a newly enrolled student in that field. And 1 in 100 in terms of a click to app to student ratio is actually a pretty good ratio. It could be much worse than that, depending on the institution and the market at that moment in time. So these are all pretty expensive numbers. You, in your head, multiply by 100. Now I'll give you an approximate idea of what it would cost to get a student using Google search as a method and cost per click payments. You see, the next ones are healthcare, health services, healthcare administration and management, cyber computer forensics and counterterrorism, again, accounting, but this time with a flavor of business management, psychiatric mental health nursing. Very interesting case here. I don't know if many of you may have seen this in the news recently, that advanced practice nurses, in this case, psych nurse practitioners, were being used very widely by the online psychiatric support organizations. Venture-backed, did a little bit of a supernova during COVID, got very popular, raised a lot of money, spent a lot of money on advertising, and it appears delivered potentially malfeasant services in many cases, prescribing drugs without adequate attention. So this may calm down a little bit in the aftermath of that. A number of those companies, I think, are going to go bankrupt. Others may be forced out of business by the various regulatory authorities. That said, I do think that the only way we're going to be able to get enough people who have the capability of prescribing mental health medications is to open up that psych nurse practitioner field and get more nurses through it, so that we have people. And by the way, psych physician assistants is another mode for doing that. But we just don't have the time or the people to get through a full psychiatric education and become psychiatrists. We'll not be able to serve the audience we need with that. So there are some yings and yangs on that particular one, but I think long-term it's probably a healthy field, but it's got some serious short-term issues. Then we see nursing administration, clinical medical social work, and religious education. Again, somebody out there's caught on to this trend of religious education. They're paying good money to attract those students, $3,700 a student. So that gives some support to the idea that there's something going on in the space around religion and its popularity in the current group of students who are thinking about going back for school. Now, we look at the other end of the spectrum, you can see how much this varies. It's 50-to-1 difference between the most expensive and the least expensive programs in terms of cost per click. And in this case, you can see Asian Studies leads the list with only 61 cents in terms of cost per click. So that'd be a $60 student if you get them. as opposed to a $5,000 student. And you can see the rest of the list. We've got law, cognitive science, and ending with forensic chemistry at about $2 per click. Couple of interesting ones here. French language and literature, no one's competing for that. And then park and recreation. So I have a client who recently is interested in this particular program and strengthening their offer there. But I pick up French because I often hear people say, I can't afford to market specific programs. I can only market the brand of the institution, which is an interesting concept. And if you were doing TV advertising or radio, it'd be very true. You can't afford to have 50 radio ads running, one for each of your academic programs. However, when you're starting to talk about cost per click and pay-per-click advertising, that's really not true because you don't pay if people don't click. And here, if we look at foreign language, there may be an opportunity to pick up some very inexpensive clicks and attract students to what have been declining programs for a fair amount of time, and to attract them at very low cost. So I think, and many of you know this or in marketing, there is the ability to market programs. And one of the strange things is if you think about how students search, they can search many ways, but let's boil it down to two for a moment. One is by brand. I'm looking for these colleges by name. And we do keep track of that. I won't share that data today. The other is I look by program. So I'm looking for French language and literature programs. Well, if you're not marketing in Google for French language and literature, you will not show up. You will literally be invisible to that potential student. So to me, it makes sense to really explore hard investing in Google and other search platforms. We're not Google advocates per se, just the one we happen to keep track of. But to think about how we can do this pay-per-click advertising against programs where it's relatively inexpensive and they're often empty seats. Now, we look at international and it's a little bit disappointing. This has been going up the last 4 months, and then November, we hit a bit of a speed bump, down 7%. But foreign students this year have been pretty interested. We're not seeing the kinds of fall-offs we did a few years ago. And this month, hopefully, is just a blip and not a trend. Now, we look at international student demand. It's interesting to see that there's a fair amount of overlap between the biggest programs and the fastest growing programs, which is a little surprising. I don't usually think of percentage growth being high in areas that are already large. But business administration management is the largest program in terms of international student interest. The next is data science. And actually, it's not only one of the largest, it's one of the fastest growing as well, growing almost 45%. And those lines across the ones where the program occurs both in the size and the percent growth. Computer science, not surprising, engineering, health services, allied health in the top 5. Business analytics then comes up. So we've really got data science said twice. And I could map that business analytics back to data science on the right-hand side as well, though it isn't technically there. They're very similar kinds of programs. Marketing and marketing management, also the fastest growing actually here. And design, then IT, up not only large, but up 15%. And public health, large and up 11%. My personal guess is that public health internationally will behave the way public health did domestically. During COVID, public health emerged as one of the fastest growing programs in terms of student interest. It's since faded, so I don't see it on those lists anymore. And I think that's just the passing, I hope, of COVID, or at least the diminished attention to COVID in our society. So I suspect that will happen internationally as well, but it hasn't happened yet. And these trends are important. There's some of these things that are likely to be a trend that'll fade quickly, sort of a fad. I'd put public health in that category, albeit a pretty grim fad. And so you're not going to want to stand up a public health program if you don't already have one, because it happens to tick up for a few months. But you can look at it from a marketing perspective and say, this one's hot. Let's get on that. Let's increase our marketing against that particular program and take advantage of the growth while it lasts, and recognizing that it's going to ramp down. So I'd be very careful about putting in place large fixed cost structures, labs, that kind of thing. During that process, what you really want to do is just be able to track the incremental students who may be interested in that, and then ramp it back down if the interest fades, or not if it doesn't. Now we picked one program here that linguistics, and we're going to, look at where those students physically come from and where they want to go to. So the leading country in terms of interest in linguistics is actually Bangladesh. And I'm always surprised when I think of a country that's that poor, that it could lead a list like this. But it's also got an enormous population, some of whom have the wherewithal to go internationally for school. Similar story to a lesser degree in India. And then we see Turkey, Iran, Vietnam. I've seen Vietnam on this list for a while now. I think it's a very interesting place. And, having grown up during the Vietnam War, I'm always shocked that the Vietnamese are as open as they are to Americans and American education in particular, but delighted to see it. Then we see Germany, Pakistan, Brazil, Nigeria, and the United Kingdom. Where do those students want to go? Well, it looks like they want to go surfing. California is by far the highest state of interest. Then we have New York coming in second. Now let's switch over and look at current demand. That is, what programs students are enrolling in now. Where does this data come from? We have an agreement with the National Student Clearinghouse. So again, very comprehensive data, all Title IV institutions, and updated very frequently. This is actually for the academic year 21-22, and we're looking at spring semester, as I recall. What's number one? Business in terms of enrollment, not surprising. Social work is number two. I'll come back to that because it concerns me. Computer science, number three. Business analytics, fourth. There's nursing, not surprising. And there'd be a heck of a lot more nursing enrollment if we had more nursing seats. But as many of you know, the number of seats in nursing are constrained by a variety of regulators. So we're continuously underserving the need in the employment market for nurses. Then we have education general, accounting, special ed, curriculum and instruction. So 3 of the top 10 are actually in education. And finally, healthcare management. So a couple of business, couple of education, and then kind of a grab bag, 3 of education and a grab bag elsewhere, a variety of different kinds of fields in terms of new student enrollment. Now, what's growing fastest? Well, I remember that 3 things I told you to watch for. There's data science leading the list. Now, remember, that's growing, it's 91% on top of it being a decent sized program already. Then we see computer science growing 41%, computer engineering general up 30%, and information technology project management up 25%. So while we've all heard the story on the employment side, that employment in some of these fields may be slowing down, although I'm a bit skeptical on that. I'll come back to that. On the student side, these are still course programs of great interest. Though this data too, remember, is from just before it's spring, just before the jobs in the high-tech space started to drop off at Meta and places like that. And often students, honestly, when you see a bubble like this, they come in late. So they arrive at the party after it's already over in many cases. And that may be happening to a degree here. Though what I've heard, and this is more anecdotal than factual, is the banks and other large institutions have been trying to hire these folks, the data scientists and so forth, for ages, and they haven't been able to win them in battles against Google and Meta and others. And now that those folks are coming loose, there's all kinds of demand in other industries for that expertise. So my suspicion is that the skills here are still scarce enough that there'll be a very healthy job market for the students who go into these programs now. But that is my opinion, and I don't have the data really to back it up, because getting decent forecasts of what's going to happen in employment is, I believe, actually impossible. Not BLS forecasts notwithstanding, they're just not accurate enough to really rely on. Then we see a few other things: teacher ed, multiple levels, architectural and building sciences tech, industrial engineering, sustainability studies, and dietetics, dietitian. In the calendar year 21-22, at the bachelor's level, business administration and management had the highest enrollment, followed by biology, think of all your pre-meds, psychology, general, registered nursing, again, not surprising, computer science, criminal justice, mechanical engineering, kinesiology, engineering general, and elementary education and teaching. Now, if I go back here, there's been one of the things that I find troubling when you look at these lists and you see things that don't feel right. And there are a few fields here that I always worry about. Psych is one of them, because it often ends up with folks who go into into support functions out there. I'm sorry, social support. I'm blanking on the name. You know, when you think about that, one of the challenges we have is that with the price of college, and particularly grad school, which is required for going into some of those fields, got to be very careful with price, because the tuition that we're going to see for somebody, let me just drop back and prompt the name again. Somebody's going to end up in social work is really high. And there are people charging $60,000 a year for a master's in social work for somebody who's going to graduate and make $50,000 if they're lucky. So I do think it's one of the places where we not only need to look at student demand and jobs, those are both very high. We got to look at wages as well and make sure that the wages are going to be able to pay for our fair trade for the amount of debt the student's going to take on. And I think that leads us down a path actually of having differential tuition by program, so that some of these programs where the known outcomes are very low wages but are very important to our society can be met without bankrupting the students who go down that path. Among bachelor's program, finance enrollment grew the fastest. So there's some folks out there that want to make money. Cybersecurity, information assurance was number 2. Again, that theme, you see computer science a little bit further down the list. And I'll bet you there's I'm just looking down. I don't see, actually it's interesting. I don't see the data science part here, which I would have expected. Marketing management, computer science, neuroscience, 2 arts and fine arts, aviation, economics, and psychology. Now let's look at the backwards looking indicator so we can see long-term trends. That would be iPads. In terms of highest completions at the master's level, not surprising, we're looking at business administration and management, always been one of the bigger programs out there. Then we see social work, and again, I worry about that, not because there aren't students, not because there aren't jobs, but because we've got to make sure that tuition and wages are aligned. Business analytics, computer science, there's registered nursing, not surprising, one of the bigger programs out there, and as I mentioned, very important in terms of our ability to deliver healthcare, particularly as we get into certain vertical fields where there's just not enough doctors. Education leadership and administration, education general, curriculum instruction, and special ed, 4 education programs here in the largest master's programs. And finally, accounting in 9th place. And I look at education, I worry about that too, for the same reason. Often a master's is required. In many cases, a doctorate degree is really required. But the pay, it may not really be commensurate with the cost of those degrees. Just has to be kept in mind as you're developing that curriculum and thinking about where you can spend financial aid and so forth. Masters from 2016 to 2021, business analytics was actually the top program here. Only a handful of years ago, this program wasn't even in the data set. It was included under kind of other programs. But business analytics, number 1, applied behavior analysis, also an analytical program. Number 2, financial analytics, number 3. And a little bit further down the list there in red, we have data analytics or data science. So in terms of master's completions, 4 of the top 10 programs are in one way or another related to data analytics. Then we see digital media, clinical medical social work, cybersecurity information assurance, again making this list, medical informatics, nursing education, and athletic training. In 2021, in terms of completion volume at the bachelor's level, again, we see business number 1, but nursing is right on its tail with 165,000 completions. Psychology is in 3rd, biology, business sciences, pre-med again in 4th, among other things you can do with that degree. Computer science, accounting, finance, criminal justice, marketing management, and political science. So one of the things when I look at the top 10 for bachelor's, it's interesting just how eclectic the list really is. You get up to the master's level, it gets more focused, but here we see really still a little bit of everything in terms of what students are interested in. Or being more precise, what students were interested back in 2015, 2016 when they chose their majors. Fastest growing in terms of completions, data analytics or data science, number 1 by a ways, a 23% annual growth in completions over this period. Cognitive science, number 2, digital arts, sustainability studies, human biology, computer software engineering. Then we see business analytics, not only analytics programs coming up with 16% annual growth, cybersecurity, and finally real estate development. So that analytics plus cyber and software is really a strong segment, and in general, health tends to be, although health is not particularly well represented on this list. So let's take a look at employment now, shifting away from student demand and looking what employers want. First thing is, as all of you know from reading the papers, job posting volumes and hiring are off. There's an increase in layoffs, still not much of an increase in unemployment. And if we looked at this and compared it back to pre-COVID, I think we'd find that these numbers are actually kind of reasonable. Even November's number is going to be comparable to a 2020 number, not down 56%. In 2021, we saw a huge spike in job postings, really unprecedented in modern times. There's never been anything like it that I know of. So that's fallen off as the economy returns to what I would call normal. And it may be dipping below normal now. When we come back next month, we'll add 2020 back in so you can see the 3-year trend and understand whether this is actually just reverting to normal or if it's actually beginning to dip and showing early signs of recession. And remembering, of course, that in general, this may not happen this time, but recession is generally good for higher ed as students return to school to get credentials. Highest job posting volumes, registered nursing. And again, we have this high job postings and constrained number of seats for most nursing programs. So I hope at some point we'll be able to loosen that up so we can actually meet the needs of the employers. And of course, in this case, the patients. General and operations managers, and let's look at management as a whole. We've got 5 of the top 10 in terms of job postings are management positions. General and operations managers, first line supervisors of production workers, first line supervisors of administrative support workers, first line supervisors in retail, and finally marketing managers. So there's a big uptick in need for managers, again, probably following COVID and downturn in many of those jobs. Computer support is up there in the top 10. We've also got software development, QA, HR, first line, and then finally tax preparers. And this has been a surprise category for me. As we approach tax season, one could imagine that that's just, the tax guys getting ramped up. But actually, this has been going on for 4 or 5 months now, and tax is a very rapidly growing category. God knows who wants to do that work, but it is needed. And with the federal government hiring some 86,000 tax auditors, we're going to need a lot more tax preparers and a lot more people to help us should we get audited. And here you see it again, job postings, year-over-year growth, tax examiners and collectors and revenue agents, that would be the federal government at least, and maybe others ramping up their tax collection activities, up 189%, and tax preparers up 58%. And then we see really a grab bag of other jobs that are growing. Coaches and scouts, special ed, forest inspectors and forest fire inspectors and prevention specialists, training and development, airfield operations, optometrists, nurse practitioners, and counseling and school psychologists. Now, as many of you know, and a lot of you are taking advantage of, much of the growth that's happening now is actually not in traditional degree subjects. Is not oriented towards traditional degree granting courses or programs. So let's take a look at the things people are taking down at the course level. And for us, what we find is that the easiest way to look at this is to go to some of the large MOOCs, the massively open online course providers. We happen to look at Coursera. They're kind enough to publish the number of students enrolled in their programs. And by tracking that on a monthly basis, we can tell how many new students have enrolled. So keep in mind that the numbers we're looking at here are the total enrollment since the day any of these programs was conceived and offered on Coursera. So over that whole period of time that machine learning has been a program, some 47,300,000 students have taken it. Excuse me, let me be precise, enrolled in it. A fraction of those students ever completed the course or program. Many have come in, maybe learned what they wanted and left. And it's just hard to maintain interest when you've got very little at stake, minimal payments or none. So people wander in and wander out. But it is still a valid indicator. Think of this as a massive survey telling you what people are interested in right now. I wasn't surprised to see machine learning on the top of this list when we first started doing it, because I've always thought of these sites as a way of learning about technology in particular. But then look at some of the next ones: English, science of well-being, English for career development, learning how to learn, and jumping down, the Stanford Introduction to Food and Health. So this whole category of personal growth turns out to be very important in this, purchase by course instead of by program area. Let's see, we've got neural networks and deep learning, not surprising. Programming for everybody, Python, very popular coding language. So those are traditional tech that I would say I expect to see here. And then some other things I wouldn't have expected, financial markets. And then I've been watching COVID contact tracing, so that's not a surprise. So I am relieved to see it's dropping. It used to be up in the top 2 or 3, and now it's down, in 10th place. And I hope that's because the number of cases to track has gone down. But in any case, the interest in learning that skill is declining. Now, fastest growing courses, again, I would have thought this would all be tech, but we look at our first 4 and they're really not tech. English for career development, the science of well-being, learning how to learn powerful mental tools, speak English professionally. So there's a large audience of people, I suspect most of them overseas, who are interested in learning how to speak and write English more effectively. There are also people who want to learn other languages, neural networks and deep learning, for example, user experience design, programming in Python. So if you will, computer languages have a similar place in the world to normal spoken languages. And then we see data science, again, foundations, data everywhere, financial markets, and an introduction to psychology. Now, Udemy is a bit different than Coursera. It's another one of the massively online open course networks. It's also free or paid depending on the individual course, but it has a more tech spin than Coursera. And you see that in the outcomes here. Web development, top of the list. Programming languages, number 2. IT certifications, other IT and software, network security, data science, Microsoft. This is more what I would call the traditional list you'd expect to see in a MOOC. But there we have it in the top 10, language learning. And all the schools I go to, languages are down. They've almost disappeared. In many cases, there are 2 or 3 students left by graduation in a language like French. At many institutions, honestly, a shame. I mean, there was a time when I could speak some decent French and Italian. Those days sadly have long passed. But I think there is real value in learning languages. And it's just kind of atrophied in the US in terms of student interest. But it's not gone, as you see here. And so it may be that we need to shift from teaching languages really in terms of academic programs and more into courses that students can enroll in, probably online, and take those either because they need to learn a language, or in many cases, I think these are adult learners who just always wanted to learn a language or finish up what they learned in high school, and are now coming back and taking them in this format. Then we see business analytics and intelligence and mobile development. Now, I'm going to take a trip a little further afield. Recently, Gray has begun collecting data on college sports and the costs and of those sports, and all sorts of other statistics like how many players are there on a team, how much do the coaches cost, what are the other costs associated with it. But importantly, for those who work with us on their economics, we can not only see the cost of those students, but we can also see the revenue generated by athletes who pay tuition to attend the college and attend the courses. Often a missing ingredient there. I don't have that data to share today, but let's get started by just looking at the costs for athletic programs. And it's interesting. We're going to look at Division II schools here, starting with large schools. And for some reason, basketball is actually one of the most expensive sports, with an cost of $89,000 per athlete for women's, and a similar number of $84,000 for men's. Then we drop off by almost 2/3 to women's volleyball, women's golf, men's volleyball. Then a fairly sharp drop again as we move outdoors to men's soccer. I cannot understand how golf can be cheaper than other things, given greens fees and stuff, but it is at $20,000 an athlete. Women's softball and men's baseball and water polo, all in that same range, around $20,000 per athlete. So in a small private college with relatively high tuition, the tuition might, in fact, make these programs, these sports programs, a positive contributor to campus life. In a public institution with lower tuition, that'd be tougher to pull off with these relatively high cost programs. Where is it growing fastest in terms of cost? Women's fencing, pretty niche sport. You may be able to attract some full pay students with that. Women's riflery, men's riflery up, both up over 25%. Men's skiing and women's skiing up substantially as well. And then we see men's weightlifting, women's track and field, women's rodeo and men's rodeo. Those latter two up 7 to 8%. So some pretty substantial cost increases in what it takes to deliver sports in a number of areas. And something we'll have to keep an eye on. People often think of the rising cost of college being the rising cost of teaching. Often that's not the case. It's not actually the instruction that's driving the cost up. It may be sports that are relatively expensive. Oftentimes it's student sport, which is increasingly large, very important, but increasingly large and expensive field. And other things that surround the educational experience, but aren't actually instruction. So as we look at small schools still within Division II, it turns out ice hockey is really expensive. Not too surprising considering you got to have a rink and keep it cold, but also have a lot of travel involved in these two sports. Since the colleges that offer it are often fairly far apart. I hear people, hiring a bus and having to drive 4 to 6 hours to get to their competitions. In some cases flying, though not as much in Division II as Division I. Then you see men's and women's skiing, not surprising, you got to pay to get on the slope. Men's basketball and women's basketball, also pretty expensive here. You see weightlifting, both men and women, and women's golf and women's tennis on this list amongst the most expensive programs per athlete. Where's the growth in cost? What do we have to rein in? Turns out rodeo, who knew, is rising pretty rapidly. Then we see women swimming and diving, men all track, women all track, men in field outdoor, women beach volleyball, women's wrestling, women's track and field outdoor, and women's softball, all with almost all with double-digit increases in costs, except for women's softball. The other thing I found interesting here, if you exclude rodeo, the change in cost is pretty consistent between men and women. Doesn't look to me as there's any real pattern there in terms of men's sports becoming more expensive or women's sports becoming more expensive. Tends to be the same sport and approximately the same increase for both men and women. Now let's take a look at one academic program in a little bit more depth. When we do that, we look at 4 dimensions here. In particular, we're looking at markets now: student demand, employment, competition, and degree fit. The other aspects of this program are present in our systems, but they're all proprietary to individual clients, so I won't be able to share those today. A little bit later, we will be able to give you benchmarking data so you can see what it costs for one of these programs, but that we don't have that for you today. We're looking at one of the top 20 programs offered based on the market scores that we do, which reflect individual scoring on about 50 variables. And in particular, these are all the programs that scored about 98th percentile and above compared to 1,500 other programs that we track in our system. What's driving these two, all these really, when you look at it, is student demand and employment. The picture on competition is very mixed. In fact, this program only scores in the 31st percentile for competition, while it's in the 99th percentile for student demand and employment. You'll see that degree fit is 50 percentile all the way down. The reason for that is that we don't know what level of degree you may be interested in, and therefore we can't assess degree fit. So we just assign 50 to everything when we're doing our webinars. But if we were working with you, we would actually have this tuned so that it would appropriately score and rank, score on that degree fit percentile and highlight programs where they're a fit with the degree level that you have to offer. So, for a community college, there'll be a low score for brain surgery, and at the doctoral level, there'll be a low score for auto tech when we do degree fit percentile. We add in those scores that are custom to an individual institution. Here, again, we've just averaged it out at 50th percentile. Let's dive in a little deeper. You'll see with all our data, since I'm a history major, eventually I get tired of looking at individual numbers and trying to interpret them. So we color code them. Dark green is great, top 2% of all our programs. red is bad. And if you get down to that pink section, you're in the 40th percentile or lower. So we color code each of the 50 variables so you can at a glance know whether it's doing well or poorly, again, relative to the other 1,500 programs that we keep track of. In this case, when we look at education, on student demand, it ranks very highly. Just look down this column here on student demand and then size. So this is it a big program or not? It's at the 98th or 99th percentile on every metric we have for size. Growth, much more mixed bag. We're up in the 90s on some, 38th percentile on others. And I'll walk through the detail in a moment. But what I want you to take away is when you understand how to look at the data, it's pretty easy to get an overall sense, a gestalt, if you will, of what's healthy and what's not. Again, looking at size, right away you can see it's very big. And the growth bears inspection. Some of the metrics are positive, some are negative. So it's a mixed bag, if you will. And you can tell that really in a couple seconds. But let's look at this in a little bit more depth. Google search volume with 582,000 searches, very large. We can tell 98th percentile. So of our 1,500 programs, that's one of the top 30 in Google search volume. International page views, 99th percentile, so strong international interest in the program. New student enrollment volume, 539, 90th percentile. On-ground completions, very strong, 99th percentile. But importantly, online completions by in-market students. I'll explain what that is in just a second. 99, so is at the 99th percentile. So this is not only a strong on-ground program, it's actually a very strong online program as well. Now, what does that completions by in-market students mean? Well, let's assume for a moment that this data was for Ohio. Those completions would be for students who took an online program where the student was located in Ohio, but the school might be somewhere else in the country. So for example, many students in Ohio now enroll in programs offered by Western Governors University. In traditional reporting, those Ohio students would show up in Utah where Western Governors is headquartered. But what we do is use some data, publicly available data on where students actually are located to move those students back in the market in which they're actually sitting. So you can see the competition, if you will, in your local market, as well as the student demand that's being absorbed by out-of-state institutions. Now let's jump down to all this change stuff. Let me start with completion volume. You can see it's down 1,200. So what does that really tell us? It tells us that 4 or 5 years ago, it's a bachelor's program, right? So people take 4 to 6 years to complete and probably pick their major either upon entry to the school or within a year or so afterwards. So again, you'd subtract 4 or 5 from 2021 and you end up back in 2015, 2016. So at that time, relatively few people, there was a decline in enrollment, and that may have been exacerbated by a decline in graduates because of COVID. So again, retrospectively looking a bit of a decline. As we look at our current indicator, it's actually up 8%. That's not a huge number. That turns out to be the 40th percentile, but still positive. And remember, this is one of the biggest programs in the United States, so an 8% increase is actually very material. And then we look at the Google search change percent, and it's up 12%. So the way I would say this is this program was down several years ago. It's currently growing, and looking forward, that growth is likely to accelerate. Now let's switch over and ask ourselves, will there be jobs for these graduates? And what kind of money are they going to be able to earn upon graduation? Now so let's start with what we call direct prep. And that is the jobs that people could get for which they're directly prepared. So obviously in teaching, if they get a graduate education in teaching, they go into teaching, that's directly prepared. And that's very relevant for this particular field because 67% of the folks who graduate, in fact, go into fields for which they're directly prepared. 33% obviously don't. You may think, well, that's odd that so many people would not, go into something else. But actually, that's a relatively low number going elsewhere. 80% of programs, less than 20% of students go into the fields for which they're directly prepared. So in that sense, this is a bit of an outlier. There's a very tight relationship between the degree people get here and the jobs they actually go do. And we have 2 indicators here, job postings and BLS job openings. In this case, they're fairly well aligned, but there is a common pattern in certain jobs. I was just looking at it this morning, and teaching is one of them, where there may be one job posting, but it actually represents several jobs. If you're a state or a school district, you might post a job for English teacher, You may actually need 6 English teachers, and you'll just keep accepting people off that one job posting until you filled all those positions. So there's a systematic understatement in job postings of the number of actual jobs available. So BLS job openings helps to shed light on that. We can see here that's actually a much higher number than the number of job postings, it's about 44% higher. So robust market, very large. Again, all our size indicators are dark green. I look at the bachelor's outcomes. This is where we take into account that 33% of the people who don't in fact go into what they're directly prepared for. In this case, don't go into teaching. And there are a number of jobs out there outside of teaching that these folks end up in as well. But compared to the number within their field, it's actually not that large. So I'd say it's a direct prep field and lots of opportunity in the specific disciplines for which folks are prepared. Now let's look at growth. And there are 3 indicators we look at here. Last year, down 3.8%. 3-year, which begins to smooth out the effects of COVID, basically flat. And the BLS 10-year forecast up 0.5%. And I would just say be very careful with that 10-year forecast. I mentioned earlier, 80% of the time that's off by 50% or more. And they get the sign right. That is, they can tell you whether a program is growing or shrinking about 62% of the time. So they're wrong 48% of the time. Recall that a coin toss would be accurate about 50% of the time. So the BLS forecast is really not that much better than a random walk. And that's not because BLS is dumb. It's just very, very difficult to forecast labor markets because you have to be able to forecast the US economy and how that's going to shift by occupation. And I would argue that's nearly impossible. And if I were all of you, when I think about programmatic growth and where you're going to invest, number one thing is to invest in flexibility. Because the idea that you're really going to be able to predict what courses and programs you need to be teaching in 10 years with any accuracy based on job market data, I don't think that's very realistic. Just think if we went back 12 to 18 months ago and you said, is there going to be growth in jobs for programmers going forward? The answer would have been for sure. And then lo and behold, in March, everybody started laying off programmers. So keep in mind the value of flexibility of being nimble as you make your investments in programmatic growth. And wages, modest. They're not, well, they are, modest as being flattering. These jobs for these folks come in between the 9th and the 31st percentile in income. Not a surprise. In the US, we don't pay teachers very well. And education job postings did drop along with everything else in November, down 34%. And as we look at the job posting data within the space, preschool had the highest volume, also the lowest pay. We see elementary schools, second lowest pay, teaching assistants, education administrators, post-secondary, and so forth, ending with special ed teachers for middle school. Now let's compare this to wages. And again, I was starting to hint at this. Elementary school teachers, lots of jobs, but only a $62,000 wage. We're willing to pay administrators more. Interesting question why that is. But they make $87,000. Secondary school teachers, 66, special ed, similar number. Preschool, much, much lower. Post-secondary, quite a bit better. Well, not a lot better, really, $59,000. Guidance counselors, 65, so a little bit higher there. Other at 50. Managers, again, we pay managers in education a lot more. I would argue that managing is a heck of a lot easier and lower skilled than being a good teacher. But unfortunately, I don't control wages out there. And finally, we see librarians at 60,000. So there's an interesting trend here where we're willing to pay people who manage and administrate schools more than we pay people who actually teach students. I'm really not sure why that's the case. Certainly, if you think of value created for society, I can make a pretty good argument that most of that value is created in a classroom. Though certainly educational leadership is also very important. But interesting yin and yang. Part of it is just we need a lot more teachers than we do administrators. So changing the price or the payment for teachers has a much bigger impact on school budgets than the pay for administrators because there are many fewer administrators. Let me finish up. In terms of competition, not surprising. Everybody out there's got an education program, so 99th percentile in terms of volume. But here's some important indicators. Average program completions, 35, median, 14. So if you think about that at the bachelor's level, there are about 6 students for every completion. So I'd look at that and say it's about 100 students in the average in the median ed program. Pretty good in terms of program size, and it's still going up. So that means this market is probably not yet saturated. On the other hand, my cost per click and my Google completion index are a little high, 66th to 94th percentile. And my national online education institutions at 145, pretty robust number there. A lot of institutions offer this. 30% of that 358 institutions offer a program online, and my national online share of completions is 38%. So it is a pretty popular way to get your degree to actually go online instead of to a campus. And what degrees are needed? Well, in terms of completions, it's all about masters. In terms of student volumes, it's mostly at the bachelor's level with 62% of students enrolled in bachelor's programs. In terms of what people need out there, surprising number of no college and some college employed in this field, probably in administrative roles or in lower levels of education. But bachelor's and master's only taking 36% of jobs, which honestly to me is surprising. And this is a field dominate's not the right word, where the plurality of people are white women. White men, relatively rare. 12% of folks completing this are men, white men. Hispanic women, 12%, Black women, 7%. So if we added up women there, we'd be at 58, 63%, 64% of all the instructors are white women, Hispanic women, or Black women. Pick up another 4% with Asian women. So very, as we all know, heavily weighted towards women in this particular discipline. And finally, we put it all together on a single page so you know what's going on out there, and you can see all these dimensions in one place. Makes it much easier for you to make decisions because you don't have to hunt around through dozens or hundreds of pages of documents to find the essential data that you need. So let's look at this overall. Google searches for academic programs increased 9% year over year. Very promising. It's been over 6 months of continuous growth in Google search. And I hope we'll start to see those students showing up in classrooms soon. 3 of the top 10 programs are in the arts. The fastest growing master's degree was in data science. In November, strong employer demand for managers in particular. Tax is a rapidly growing job market, as we saw. Demand for masters in education is very high, student demand and employment demand, but wages are not so great. And the program is very competitive. That's competitive amongst colleges. Lots of folks offer it. Still a good, healthy sized program though. Now let me stop, remind you, we've got that emerging programs for 2023. And if your eyesight is as weak as mine, you can just barely read. That's going to be on Thursday, January 12th at 2 p.m. And if you'd like a more in-depth description of how to do program evaluation and management, I hope you'll pick up a copy of my book, Stop, Start, or Grow. Now, we probably have time. I've run a little long here for at least one program that may be of interest to all of you. So if there's one you'd like, please let us know. And I'm happy to run over, and anybody who wants to stick with us for a few more minutes, we can cover a couple programs for you. So let me stop sharing. I'll turn it over to Wanel.
Hello, everybody. Happy holidays. I'm not sure we've gotten any requests yet. Some great questions about keywords for psychology doctorate programs, PhD versus PsyD. Is that how we say it?
PsyD, yeah. PhD would be the research side of it, and a PsyD is going to be the practicing psychiatrist kind of thing, if I recall correctly.
Yeah, no request. I'll just quickly show the program rank and see if there's any programs here that people are curious about.
I do, Furman, I see your comment while he's pulling that up. Yeah, 60% of people in college now are women, 40% men. So love to see that get back in balance. We got plenty of room on campus for the men who are not going to college. And honestly, we really need them to go, both for their own livelihood as well as because I'm going to say this out loud: undereducated men are being very disruptive in our society right now, and in many cases are really having a hard time in life as well, as we see in the sudden decline in life expectancy for men, particularly men without a college degree. So very difficult environment for men without a college degree right now.
Since there's no request, I'll just quickly touch on just that psychology example. I gave you a couple of ways to get some industry demand using the job postings keyword search, and then using the Google search keyword. You can also get somewhat of a proxy for student demand in the Google search space, which can overcome, right, the student demand and the employment data that you're looking for in the markets tool that we can't really get to specifically PsyD versus PhD. But to get to that competitive level insight, keep in mind, there's going to be a lot of overlap, I would imagine, with how these institutions are reporting out this program. So keep in mind, you're probably going to want to leverage more of like a 4-digit zip code when trying to get the competition for the program. And again, if there's any questions on that, we're happy to find some time and connect further on, how to maximize the data out of the system for some of those programs that aren't as particularly tied to a specific zip code. So just let us know. A lot of workarounds in the system that we can overcome. Yeah, I don't see open. No, just a thank you. You're welcome.
All right. I think we're all set. And again,
Yeah,
thank you all.
I just have to point one thing out, and that's 1L's hat.
Happy holidays, everyone.
Happy holidays, and look forward to seeing all of you on the Emerging Programs webinar in January.